To Anger's Credit. Chapter 1. Clayton walked ahead on the narrow deer trail. The soft crunch of his footfalls in the snow could barely be heard. Decker, following behind, took extra precautions to place his feet in the same place and in the same way as Clayton had, doing his best to remain as quiet as possible. If he wasn't, the black eye Clayton had given him yesterday wouldn't be lonely long. Decker's nose was cold, his whole face was cold, and as for his feet, they were numb. The snow had found its way into his ragged boots and melted against his skin, soaking his feet, each step squeezing water from his wool socks, sending it gushing up his ankles, ensuring nothing in his boots could keep its warmth. His body shivered as he stifled a whimper. Clayton's footsteps stopped, and Decker froze, his eyes fixed to the back of Clayton's head. He tried his hardest to remember if he had made any noise, a fear pricking him from within. Clayton moved without sound, his clothing in fear of him as well, Decker imagined. His hands were nimble and strong, maneuvering the old rifle. He pressed it into the crux of his shoulder and fired. The shot broke the peace of the forest, and sounds of life became hushed and afraid. The shot had startled Decker, causing him to lose balance, falling backward into the snow. Clayton's head turned, and as his body followed, the barrel of the old rifle pointed at Decker sitting in the snowbank. "Clayton," Decker's voice was quiet and timid. The sound of it sent a flash of angered annoyance across Clayton's face. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His face conveyed the disgust that he bore for his younger brother, and they were void of empathy. But behind that void was a glint of sadness. Decker shivered from within, and it could not be all attributed to the cold alone. Clayton broke his gaze, looking away, almost regretful, as he lifted the rifle's barrel, setting it against his shoulder, and walked over to his younger brother, extending his hand. "Get up," said Clayton, his voice flat and narrow. "You can't remain a coward forever." "Sorry," whispered Decker, averting his gaze as he took Clayton's hand. "Don't be sorry. Don't say that word to me again. Sorry won't keep you from starving. Sorry won't keep you warm. Sorry don't make life easier." Clayton shoved the rifle into Decker's hands. "You'll shoot the next one we see, and if you miss, I'll beat you." Clayton's eyes were harsh and cold. The rifle felt odd in Decker's hands. He had never fired a gun before. It was heavy and awkward to hold. Clayton turned, feet crunching the snow, towards the fallen deer. Chapter 2. Dixie scurried about in the kitchen. His mother sent her this way and that for whatever item they would need next to finish dinner. All the while, the wooden floor creaking as if in protest of the movement. "Quickly now, Dixie," urged Mother, wiping her hands on her apron. "We'll get supper fixed just as the boys should be getting back from the hunt." "Yes, ma'am," chirped Dixie, as she peppered the pot of stew that sat upon the old iron stove. "That should be enough, dear. Now, let's—" Mother looked around for what needed to be done next, and catching a glimpse out of the window. "Oh, it's getting dark so early these days," Mother said, as a half-frown pushed upon her face. "I'll put the candles in the windows for Decker and Clayton," said Dixie. "Oh, yes, thank you, sweetheart. And where are your sisters?" Mother stuttered, her mind split between looking around for something she couldn't quite remember and her children's whereabouts. "I think they're in the barn again, chasing the chickens," Dixie said, with a slight grin crossing her face as she could hear the sound of the girls laughing from the barn. She lit 4 small candles, placing them on the window's ledge. "I swear those girls will send me to an early grave. Go tell Father supper is almost ready. Then bring the girls in." "Yes, ma'am," Dixie said, walking to the back of the house and knocking on the study door. "Pa?" "Come," said his low, gruff voice from inside. "Supper is almost ready," said Dixie, poking her head into the room as Father sat behind his desk, his reading glasses nearly falling off the end of his nose. Yes, I suppose it's time for a break." His voice trailed off into a mumble as his attention was drawn back to his papers. "Is it a difficult case this time?" Dixie asked. "No, not quite, my dear. A small dispute over grazing lands for cattle. It's the men involved that will be troublesome. If I'm not properly prepared." Father looked back to his papers and continued reading, losing himself. "He's already forgot I mentioned supper," thought Dixie, another small smile finding her face. "Pa, supper," she started saying, but was cut off by the sound of hoofbeats coming up the road from town. The house went silent as the hoofbeats came closer and closer. Mother came to the study doorway. "Are we expecting company?" she asked, her face filled in puzzlement. Father stood, walking around his desk, his brow furrowed, thinking cast upon his face. "We are not," he said in a quiet, slow tone. "I'll set a few more places at the table," chirped Dixie. But as she moved forward, Father caught her wrist, his fingers gripping her hard, and she winced. "Pa, you're hurting me." "Shh," his finger placed in front of his lips, and his face utterly changed from moments ago. It was a look she had never seen before. It took Dixie a moment or so to place it. Fear. Her heart skipped a beat as the horses outside stopped in front of the house, the hoofbeats being replaced by the crunch of boots on snow. A shotgun blast ripped through the front door, sending splinters careening about within. Mother screamed, scrambling into the room, slamming the door shut behind her. Father wrenched on Dixie's wrist, pulling her to the back of the study. His fingers dug into her, gripping tightly, and though they hurt, she was in a daze. Panic, fear, and disbelief washed over her, rinsing her clean of calm and clarity. Father grabbed both her shoulders, shaking her back to the moment. "Crawl to the barn. Don't let any of them see you." He said the words, but Dixie didn't understand them. Looking at his lips and eyes, seeing his features arranged in some way completely foreign to her. "Find your sisters. Run to the forest. Do not return no matter what you hear. Do you understand? Dixie!" His voice was panicked, and she stared at him. His palm struck across her face. It burned from the slap. She came back to reality as Father broke out the small window in his study with a book. He lifted Dixie off the floor, putting her feet first through the window, lowering her slowly, gripping only to his hand. "To the barn, and then to the trees. No matter what you hear, do not return." He let go. She fell, her knees buckling as her backside sunk into the snow. Chapter 3. Dixie was staring up at the window, hoping with every moment a familiar face would fill the space and tell her that she had dirtied her dress and that a lady shouldn't behave in such a way, playing in the snow without a coat. But no face came to the broken glass. No eyes peered down at her. There was a loud crash of wood breaking from in the house, and her heart skipped in fear, sending panic throughout her. She could hear talking, but the words were low and inaudible. Father's words rushed to her mind and strangled it. "No matter what you hear," his words came back to her. She began to crawl, and again the words repeated in her mind. "No matter what you hear." Her fingers found the stream behind the house, its frigid water washing over her. She lay in the small ditch being soaked, the cold forcing breath from her. She was hidden there, out of sight of the house. She crawled in the muck and mud. She could hear deep voices of several men, but still couldn't make out their words. She heard Mother's whimper, and Dixie froze in the stream, in the ditch, in the cold, her panic gripping her, causing her hands to sweat. Father's voice arose. She knew it instantly, but as soon as she had heard it, there was a sound of a snapping branch, and it was gone. In its place, screams. Mother's screams. Dixie covered her ears, pressing tightly. It did little. The sound still came through and wrenched upon her. Dixie's tears were a full stream upon her face as the panic flooded her. The tightness in her chest labored, her breath causing her to shake. Her mind betrayed her, giving her images of terror-filled horrors which sent her whole body into shock. She couldn't breathe. She pulsed violently, her lungs gasping, pulling for air as if 100 stones were sitting atop her chest. She writhed in the action, leaving her spent and weary, her head faint and feeling dizzy. Her mind just had a sliver of focus, just enough to know that she must move forward. She must crawl. No matter what you hear, Father's words beat upon her. She crawled with new determination. In furious fervor, her teeth gritting, crinkling her nose as she pulled herself forward. She eyed the outline of the small barn and forced her thoughts upon it and put all she was towards it. When she reached near the back of the barn, she rushed from the ditch to the wooden wall and held her breath, waiting for any sign that she had been noticed. Hearing nothing, she squeezed through the fence and entered the barn through the goat's door that was hidden from view of the house. "Abigail! Josie!" Her words were hushed. She repeated them. There was no answer. The barn was quiet, and aside from the movement of a hen or the clack of goat hooves, all was hushed and still. A stillness that quickened her heart as she called their names again. "Abigail! Josie, where are you?" Again she called, and again without hearing a response. All the while, she was unaware that she had begun calling their names louder and louder. Boots crunched in the snow outside the barn door. Chapter 4. The deer weighed heavy on Decker's shoulder. The branch they were using to carry the carcass was narrow, digging into the muscle on his neck. It hurt. However, he uttered and showed no signs of discomfort, for fear of Clayton's rebuke. The darkness and snow hid every root and rock he could trip over as they went up and out of the gully on top of which the small farmhouse stood. Across a field it came into view. The sight struck Decker as odd, but he couldn't place it. Clayton dropped the deer without warning, causing Decker to tumble over the dead animal, falling face first into the snow. He lifted himself to see Clayton dashing towards the farmhouse. Decker was puzzled, but left the deer and hurried after him. Decker ran hard enough that his legs were burning by the time he had crossed the field. The door to the barn and the front door to the house were both splintered and smashed, hanging on but for the desperate grip of the hinges. Decker's heart leapt into his throat, choking him as he walked into the once cozy home. It was in shambles, and the shadows of the debris grew deep in the night, his home seeming as though some other place entirely. Decker heard quiet sobbing coming from the rear of the house. It was a deep sob and strained. As he turned the corner to his parents' room, he saw Clayton, and things were again strange. The dim light of the stars shining through the window pane revealed little and made everything seem as though it was some sort of dream or nightmare come to life before his eyes. Clayton stood beside the bed, the outline of the rifle pointing towards the two figures laying upon it, one dark shadow almost completely atop the other, caressing it. Decker's mind pieced the dream together at last in a rush of horror flooding his vision. He fell to the floor. "Is she dead?" Clayton's words washed over Decker, ushering the nightmare into the waking world. In his daze, Decker heard the difference from every word Clayton had ever spoken before. He had said these words in anguish, something he'd never heard from his older brother. The soft, quiet sobbing coming from the bed was heard once more, and Clayton spoke again. "You didn't save her. Where is Dixie, Abigail, Josie?" His voice laid thick blame upon father, an accusation that demanded answers, and now there was no doubt in Decker that if light could find Clayton's face, he would see his stoic brother with tears spilling from his eyes, a great sadness striking every corner of his hard, stone-like face. Clayton pulled the trigger on the rifle, and the shot illuminated the room with an unnatural, blinding flash. The image revealed by that terrible shot ensnared him whole. Decker couldn't move. He couldn't think. His mind was unable to make sense of what his eyes saw and ears heard. The image was there in front of him, and still he stared, looking for some clue that would make what he saw understandable, make it clear. Tears welled and poured from his unblinking eyes, dropping from his chin. In his confusion of grief, he never noticed Clayton leaving, nor did he hear the words Clayton spoke to him before he left. Chapter 5. The wind whipped Dixie's face as the horse sped on. She cried, though she couldn't rightly remember why. She was cold, shivering roughly in the saddle between the arms of her captor as he spurred the animal forward. The trees rushed past, becoming a single blur in the scenery. She needed to be free of her captors, needed to return to the farmhouse. She needed to find her sisters. She needed to see her mother. Her mind screamed, and at first it was a whisper in her thoughts, but now her muscles tightened against the prickly cold, and anger heated her from within, boiling over into a rage that overwhelmed her. She fought. Dixie twisted violently in the saddle, turning around and back again. She gouged wildly with her fingers, clawing at what they found. She pointed at her elbows, forcing them back into her captor with all that she could muster. Her captor only gripped her tighter, rendering her attempts utterly feeble. In his restraint of her, his face was drawn closer. Dixie did not hesitate. Her teeth sunk into him with intention to rip flesh with the bite. Her mouth filled with warm blood, and her captor's hand found her face digging into her eye. She was thrown from the horse. She slapped the earth and bounced, rolling several times. Many bones were broken. The air left her lungs, threatening never to return. She gasped, shaking, writhing in the panic, in the pain. The air finally filled her chest again, relieved in her breathing, but the agony of her mangled body rushed to her. Her eye couldn't open. Her captor had sunk his finger in deep. It felt hot, even against the cold wind. A headache began to grow behind her eye. Dixie pushed herself off the icy road, only to end up collapsing back upon it. Her shoulder was broken, pain emanating up her neck, cascading down her arm at her movements. The pain intensified, limiting her attempts. Again, she began to crawl. The voices of her captors were drawing close. She worked hurriedly with her unbroken limbs. She pulled herself along the snow-covered earth with ever more urgency as the voices grew louder. The tree line was just ahead. Thick shrubs grew beneath the trees. She could hide there and not be seen by the eyes the voices accompanied. She pulled herself in the bush under a pine tree, stifling her screams of pain. There she hid, laying quiet, stretching her hearing as far as she could to gain knowledge of where the voices were and if she had been found. She heard footsteps all around her, and she thought at any moment they would find her. But the voices never came out of the darkness with their arms outstretched to take her again. And soon enough, the voices were gone. Their footsteps swept away by the churning of the wind. Its howls was all she heard now. She breathed loudly, letting out sobs of relief as the terrors seeped from her slowly. She was tired now. All of her was aching from fatigue. The cold no longer grasped her or caused her to shiver. She thought to rest there, under the pines, in the snow. Her thoughts drifted. She was worried that Ma would be cross with her for having ridden on a stranger's horse. She was worried for the chickens and goats, for she couldn't remember if she had fed them today. She worried if they would be hungry. Like a horrible fate come to lay its claim to her again. She heard footsteps crunch the snow, and she hid more, making herself as small as she could, crawling further under the bushes before laying absolutely still. "Dixie!" a voice called out in the darkness as the footsteps walked all around her. Her heart sped wildly, closing her eyes tightly in fear. "Abigail! Josie!" the voice called out, the footsteps wandering back and forth, nearly stepping on her. Dixie covered her mouth with her hand, terror surging through her. The footsteps faded, and she was alone again. Dixie closed her eyes and somehow felt no pain from her fractured and horribly bruised body. Warmth spilled on her, through her, and she was comfortable. She decided she had no need to move, so she didn't, and wouldn't. She drifted further and further from consciousness, and just before losing her waking mind to sleep altogether, she swore she heard footsteps again. Only this time they were running. She let out a sigh, and her eyes closed as sleep finally wrapped its fingers around her, carrying her far away from the icy road, from her broken body, from the horror her captors had done to her family. Her breathing soon became slow, shallow, and in the cold caress of snow, it ceased altogether. Chapter 6. His fog lifted, and the events that Decker witnessed gave him new thought and pushed his feelings to the edge of what he had known. Anger was exposed on his heart, and with each beat from it, it stirred in him, growing. His fists had clenched. He knew not when they had done this. He pressed his knuckles into the wood floor, grinding them. Soon the discomfort from the pain and the wetness of blood was felt. Even then, he barely took heed of it, and ground them still. His tears had stopped. He felt their dried trails down his face. His eyes stared long and open. Only when they were parched, begging for moisture, did he grant them blink. In this state of focus, and thoughts anew to his thinking, it arose within him one sole purpose of what little remained of his rationale. Clayton dies. The words left his lips as a drawn-out whisper, sounding like a croak as his throat pushed them out. 2 words alone, and they were no question. They were the answer for all his agony, for all the fear Clayton had instilled within him, purposefully or not. Now these things didn't matter. Clayton dies, he whispered again. Bloodied fists beat at the floor, punching, tears falling anew from him now, but not in sorrow. These tears were from the staring, from the focus, from the anger. He did not relent, for he no longer heeded his eyes' request, and instead made his eyes and body slaves to his will. They would see his new purpose fulfilled. He stripped off his boots and socks, for he had distance to cover, and they would hinder him. He rummaged in the old clothing trunk of paws, finding dry boots and wool socks. Beneath them, his fingers brushed something cold and smooth. A pistol. His fingers traced its edges, lifted it, the steel chilling his hands. The weight of it was odd for a thing so small. His heart pounded wildly within him, but was soon calmed by his newfound purpose and unwavering focus. He gripped the hilt, tucking the gun into his coat pocket. He turned and ran out of the small farmhouse, passing the bed, passing the shattered door, passing the barn. Though his lungs and legs soon pleaded with him to stop his running, he didn't. Not even when he found odd tracks in the snow speckled with spots of black, leading beneath a pine. A flash of dread came over him, his thoughts pausing briefly on this, but ultimately brushed it aside without a second's hesitation, the anger fueling him. Clayton dies. The words tumbled from him as rambles, mumbles. Decker was sweating profusely beneath his winter clothes, and the sweat stung his eyes and tasted bitter in his mouth. He ran, and ran, though his speed was reduced to a labored struggle to put his feet and legs in front of one another. He was atop a hill when he saw the lights of the town dim in the distance, less than a mile away. His anger fanned, and had been growing his entire run, but now that anger chased away all struggle, and all pleading from his body to stop. He reached the edge of town, hovering on the edge of the dim lantern-lit streets. His breath was rigid. He coughed from running. He bent at the waist to breathe, arms upon his knees. The air was hard to pull in as he gasped. His legs quivered in pure exhaustion, threatening to collapse. Decker saw a man in dark clothing step into a building, and Decker followed, instinct mixed with rage guiding him. "Rooms are available," said a small, wired man behind a desk whose hair was not kept. The lobby was well lit, and Decker's eyes covered the room. Small tables and chairs were scattered about, with several patrons sitting. Some were standing in the establishment, some conversing quietly, and others drinking or reading to themselves. Decker lingered, searching fervently for the face he needed to see the light of life fade from. The longer he looked, the more the eyes of the patrons found him, and noticed his strangeness. He gripped the pistol in his pocket so tightly, it pulled at the wounds on his knuckles. $15 for the evening, young sir." The wired man spoke again, and gazed at him sternly now upon his unanswered remark. Decker met his gaze and backed slowly out the door, and ran once again onto the street. There was a piano tune in the distance, and without further thought, Decker hurried towards it, entering the building it was coming from. It was dimly lit, and there were far more people in this building than the previous one. His presence was entirely unnoticed. He searched again, his hands shaking with adrenaline. So many faces were hidden to him, turned away or half covered. He grew impatient, spinning wildly back and forth, craning his neck and squinting his eyes over and over. Then all at once the room was quiet. A piercing ring was all he heard. He felt his heart pound deep within, and he turned back towards the bar. Many men were sitting at it. All had their backs to him, but one he knew beyond doubt. The color of his hair, the slouch of his shoulders, and the old rifle slung across his back. Decker had stared at the image all morning long during their hunt, and now he would end it. "Clayton!" Decker's voice was a mere whimper, and was covered by the tune of the piano, as well as the laughter and talk. Decker pulled the pistol from his pocket, pointing it at Clayton's back. "Clayton!" He was still drowned out by the noise, and his anger was fanned deep within him. "Clayton dies!" Decker screamed loudly and forcefully, more so than he had ever before, so much that his throat hurt and his stomach ached from pushing. All the room's gaze was now upon him. The piano fell silent. The talk and laughter was no more. All pleasantries of the evening were chased out. Decker's eyes focused hard on the figure who turned before him and revealed Clayton's face. He stood. "Decker, did you find them?" Clayton's words washed up and over him, and they went unheard. There was no delay in him. He thumbed the hammer back and pulled the trigger. The pistol clicked from being empty, and the blood left his face, leaving him pale. Clayton's features took panic, his jaw dropping, a look of betrayal flashing deep in his eyes. Decker's anger held hot as fear burst within him, flooding him completely, embarrassment flushing his face. There was laughter from the room as Decker thumbed the hammer again, and again it clicked with an empty chamber. There was more laughter, and Clayton kept his stare fixed on Decker, his face puzzled, trying to understand. "You left them." The accusation was firm. "Just like father." He removed the rifle from his back. The laughter stopped. Any noise ceased altogether, for the whole room was now afraid of Clayton. Decker imagined. Clayton pointed the barrel at Decker, and without a single word more, he fired. Chapter 7. Decker's eyes opened with blurred vision, straining in the brightness of the day as light came gleaming in through the huge windows his bed was across from. His shoulder was in pain, and bandages were wrapped around his neck and the uppermost part of his shoulder. He was in a large room with several beds, and he was alone. He began moving as best he could, slowly pushing himself up to a sitting position. The agony in his shoulder and neck spread through his chest. He groaned loudly, and there was a crash from behind a closed door. Moments later, a flushed and elderly nurse came into the room, her feet shuffling, never fully leaving the floor. She sighed at him in disappointment. "Is there any pain?" Her question was of concern, but the tone in her voice conveyed irritation. "Some," Decker spoke, his voice trailing and weak, not wanting to trouble the already annoyed nurse. "Good." She spoke the word quickly, then continued. "That man had every right to shoot you, boy, as you pulled the trigger twice on him. Utter fool." She turned at that and shuffled towards the door. "Lucky I don't know your name, boy. For if I did, I would inform your mother of what you've done and let her and the Lord Almighty set you straight. That I would." Decker sprang up, fumbling to get out of the bed, pain wrenching upon him. "How long have I been here?" He shouted the question while he ripped the bedding from himself, desperately looking for his clothing. "What are you—" "Back in bed, boy," the nurse exclaimed, shocked from the sudden excitement. "How long?" His tone now was quite unkind, and the nurse answered in irritation. "Nearly 4 days." She began calling afar for a doctor. 4 days. Decker's nerves split. His stomach sank, flipping within. He began cursing himself with every word he could, tears welling up and poured out of him. At last he found his clothing in a broken wardrobe. He pulled on his father's boots, and his coat stained brown with dried blood at the collar. Decker was pulling on his trousers when the doctor arrived. He said things, remarked about Decker's wound or bandages or something. All the words bounced from his ears. He thought only their names now. Josie, Abigail, Dixie. He thought them over and over as he ran from the hospital, his neck aching deeply, bleeding from his stitches beneath the bandages. Decker ignored it and pushed further down the road through the snow. His legs found themselves in their strength, but even then, his running was labored. He never gained speed enough to match that night he had chased Clayton. His head began to spin as he collapsed in the snow. He picked himself back up quickly, continuing to run. He moved as fast as he could, never ceasing and straining more than his body wanted to allow. The small farmhouse came into view. He began shouting, "Josie, Abigail, Dixie." He cried through his yelling. He thought to himself that they were hidden, that they stayed hidden, that they were safe. Dixie had kept them hidden in the woods or in a shelter, and she would have made everything okay. They're alive. The thought felt odd in him, somehow. He knew it was wrong. Still, Decker yelled their names again and again. He tasted the quiet of his home, and he knew somehow that there would be no answer to his calls. He stepped into the farmhouse. The snow had entered the home and brushed over everything inside and painted it white with frost, and piled it high in other places it naturally had no right to be. He paused a while, dreading what he would find, then began searching the other rooms to no avail, and at last turned to his parents' room, and there he found them. Their two small bodies were huddled together next to the bodies of his parents, curled upon one another, and they were both very still. Decker sank to his knees, his heart breaking anew from the sorrow, but in the back of his mind the question was asked, "Where is Dixie?" He gathered himself and stood looking down on the bed that cradled so many of his loved ones, and he heard a cough. His eyes grew wide. He rushed to the bed and placed a hand on Josie's cheek. It was ice cold. He did the same to Abigail, feeling her warmth in his fingers. It was fading and far, like a small candle in the distance, but she was warm. A smile graced his face and lit his eyes. Decker lifted her small frame from the bed, having to peel Josie's arms off of her. Wrapping her in a blanket, he ran from the farmhouse, back into the snow, and back to the doctor. His progress was slow and labored. He placed each step purposefully, careful so as not to jar Abigail in any way. After what seemed like hours of treading in the snow, the town's outline came into view. His heart started beating wildly. He burst through the door of the small doctor's house. "Help her!" Decker's voice was strained and exhausted, and the stitches in his neck were torn. He was bleeding more now. He slunk against the wall, his vision blurring, his head becoming light as the room spun. No sooner did the doctor pull Abigail from his arms than the blood loss took him, and he collapsed to the floor. Chapter 8. Decker awoke to low voices and dim lighting. His bandages had been replaced and his stitches sewn anew. His head hurt and throbbed. He cleared his throat and his arms flung to his temples, feeling the ache. His eyes opened, remembering why he was there, and he sat up, speaking her name. "Abigail!" Several voices stopped, and he heard footsteps moving towards him, though his vision was poor and slowly adjusted to the dim room. A voice spoke. "Easy, lad. Leave your arm still, and do your best not to turn your head." The voice was strong and soft, and kindness was stitched into every word. The voice came from a man whose hand was easing him back into the bed. The doctor, Decker thought. "Abigail?" asked Decker again. "She's here, son, fighting best she can." Decker faded in and out of consciousness, waking intermittently to different voices talking, different shadows walking around the small hospital. His eyes opened wide, and he sat up. "Abigail!" he shouted, searching the room for his younger sister. She lay in the bed next to him. He fell out of his bed, tangling himself in the sheets. He grabbed her hand. It felt cold and clammy, her face drenched in sweat. "Abigail." His voice was sorrowful, trying to make an apology out of her name. "She's got strength within her, lad." The doctor's voice came from the corner of the room. Decker hadn't even noticed him sitting there in a large armchair, smoking a wooden pipe, the smoke piling above him. "But she is not well. A fever has set within her, and we have no medication here to treat her." Decker looked at the doctor in confusion. "But she'll be all right." "No, son. She's dying." "Fix her. Make her better." Decker's voice was laced in equal parts anger and concern. "I've done all I can. The next shipment of medicine should have been here days ago." "Then where is it? I'll ride to get it." "She won't last that long." The doctor's voice was sad as he choked back tears. "We have to do something." Decker was angrier now, nearly shouting. Abigail stirred, moaning slightly in pain. Decker stroked her hair gently. "There is only one option now, but I fear she won't survive it. I fear you won't survive it." "I'll do it. I don't care about me. If it's the only way I can save her, I'll do it." Decker's voice was firm. "I thought you would say that." "Okay, lad. Okay. You'll need to go to Barnot, the next town over." The doctor's voice trailed off, and his eyes drooped, hesitant about what he was to say next. "It's a 3-day ride, and a storm is coming in." "I don't care. I'll get there. I'll save her." Decker spoke in desperation now. "I need a horse." "I'll let you take mine," the doctor offered, also offering him a heavy coat and boots that were made of fine leather and very warm. They wrapped Abigail in thick blankets. Decker climbed atop the horse as the doctor lifted Abigail up to the saddle. Decker wrapped his arms around her, holding the reins with one hand. "Take this." The doctor stuffed some food, water, and a little bit of money in the satchel. "Ride steady and fast, son. But if she starts retching, you'll need to stop and lay her down till the fit is over, or she could drown in her own vomit." His face was grim. "You won't have long if that happens." Decker didn't waste another moment and spurred the horse forward, sending it into a full gallop. The snowflakes stung his face as they rode, the icy wind aiding the sting. The first day was dim, dismal, and bleak. Fog surrounded everything, shrouding the passing trees, making them look like pillars of shadow, looming tall and ominous. Decker couldn't start a fire that night. Everything was wet and cold. The wind whipped life out of every ember that was sparked with his flint. Abigail shivered, and he shivered. He didn't know how long he had slept, but it wasn't long. He dripped the honey water into Abigail's mouth. She swallowed, but her eyes remained closed. He lifted her back into the saddle as they rode on. The second day was easier. The fog had lifted, and the wind died down. He pushed the horse faster, making the most haste that he could. The second night was the same as the first. Wolves howled in the distance. In the dark, they mounted the horse again, but as light began to tip the pines, Abigail vomited. Decker dismounted the horse and tried feeding her again. She drank the honey water, but no sooner had he got her atop the horse did she vomit again, and this time she wouldn't swallow the little bit of sustenance he tried to give her. She retched, opening her eyes for a moment. "Decker," her little voice uttered weakly. Decker began to cry. "Mama," she called out and closed her eyes again. "Abigail." Decker sobbed, cradling his baby sister in frustration. She couldn't ride, but they were close to Barnot. He quickly broke branches from a fallen tree. He fashioned a makeshift shelter and placed Abigail inside, covering her in the blankets, taking his own coat off and wrapping her in it. He would be gone less than a day, and he would return with the medicine and doctor. He mounted the horse and dug his heels in sharply. The animal reared on its hind legs, taking off with new speed. He arrived in the town late into the afternoon. He quickly located the pharmacist and bought the medicine, a small blue vial. Decker ran from the building and down the street. He crossed in front of the bank, hearing gunfire from inside, and the doors burst open. Several men piled out of the bank, crashing into Decker, tripping over him, falling into the snow, breaking the glass vial of medicine in his pocket. "No!" Decker screamed, fighting the man who had fallen atop him. The man dropped his gun in the skirmish. Decker picked it up without thinking, pulling the trigger, firing into the man's chest, a red spray erupting out the back of him. His body fell back on top of Decker. The sheriff and a couple of deputies came rushing around a building, shooting their pistols at the robbers. Decker pushed the dead man off him and stood. A bullet caught him in the leg, sinking deep into the thigh, dropping him to his knees. "Put the pistol down," shouted a deputy. Decker dropped the gun as several robbers fled into the nearby forest, while others were left behind, raising their hands in surrender. Decker did the same, not wanting to get shot again. The deputies came over and wrestled him to the ground, placing him in shackles. "I'm not with them. Please." "Save it," grumbled a deputy. "I'm not with them either," one of the robbers spoke, glaring at Decker. "No, you don't understand. I have to get back to my sister." "Quiet," a deputy said, cracking a fist across Decker's jaw, causing the world to spin and sprouting a fierce headache. "No," Decker mumbled as he was dragged across the small town and thrown into a jail cell with the robbers. "Please, I can't be here. I have to go." "I told you to be quiet, boy." "No, you don't understand. I'm not an outlaw." "You can tell it all to a judge." "I can't. You don't. Talk to the pharmacist." "Quiet, or I'll come in there and make it so you wish you never spoke." The deputy's voice was annoyed. However, Decker persisted, leaning against the bars. "Please," he said, calming himself. "I'm not with them." The deputy stood and slammed the butt of his rifle against the bars, crushing one of Decker's fingers. He reeled from the strike, took a painful step back, only now remembering that he'd been shot in the leg. He fell to the cell floor, gripping his thigh. "Talk to the pharmacist," Decker yelled, making the deputy quite angry. The sheriff came into the building. He was tall and lean, and the wind rushed in behind him. "What's all this about?" His voice was crunching gravel as he read the room. Says he's no robber, spoke the deputy. Talk to the pharmacist. I was there, not in the bank. Pharmacist is closed for the day, said the sheriff. I can't. My sister is in the woods. Please, I have to go. The sheriff drew his pistol, pointing it at Decker. Decker winced. I don't let criminals go. Nor do I imprison innocent men. I'll speak with the pharmacist. You will remain here. Prattle on as you like. You won't be let out. There is finality in the sheriff's voice, and a seriousness that gave Decker pause, and he hesitated to speak again. He gripped his leg, attempting to soothe it, as both the sheriff and deputy left the small office. Chapter 9. Decker was weary, and his eyes were heavy as he sat leaning against the bars. The outlaws were snoring lightly, his eyes focused on the small clock hanging on the wall opposite the jail cell. He watched the hands move with increasing strain, each tick seeming to rip into him, digging into an unseen wound, keeping it open, making it unable to heal. His imagination was a horror show of Abigail dying. Tears soaked his clothing as morning light slunk through the windows. He hadn't slept. The sheriff walked in just as the clock struck 8, a flurry of snowflakes fluttering about behind him. Decker pulled himself to his feet, gripping the bars as a crutch. His leg burned deep within the muscle, and the skin around the wound had turned red. Have you spoke to the pharmacist? Decker asked. Ah, yes, that. I'll be right back, boy. The sheriff left. Decker's knuckles turned white from gripping the bars tighter as he pressed his head into them. They felt cold on his forehead. The clock ticked as his stomach churned. There was a deep ache in him now, and he felt sick. Though the room was cold, he began to sweat. The sheriff and the pharmacist came walking through the door, shimmering in the flurry. Decker's heart leapt to his throat. Well, this young lad says he was in your shop when the robbery took place, said the sheriff. Yes, he bought a tincture from me just as the bank was being robbed, I reckon. Decker's eyes closed in relief, and hope crept up his body. Thank you, Sam. I hate to imprison an innocent man, said the sheriff. Any time, Charlie, said the pharmacist as he turned and left. The sheriff unlocked the cell. Decker stepped out of it, his leg on fire. He almost collapsed. He paused, reeling from the pain, but quickly hobbled to the door. Best have that leg looked at, said the sheriff, as Decker walked out the room, barely hearing the warning at all. He stepped into the snow, thinking furiously, his thoughts swirling. Where is the horse? How am I to buy more medicine? I need to get back now. I've been gone far too long. Decker spun, his mind a shell of itself. He stopped and vomited, expelling what little substance was in his stomach. He hobbled back to the sheriff's office, standing just around the corner of the building, waiting. His thoughts hadn't caught up with what his body was doing. The wind whipped at him, pushing it cold into him as he stood still. What am I doing here? The thought was near genuine as he asked it of himself. He feigned his lack of knowing. There was a shuffle in the office of boots and spurs scraping against the wood floor. Moments later, the sheriff exited the building, wrapping himself in his coat and pushing through the snow into town. Decker's body moved on its own as his thoughts were still catching up with his actions. He opened the door and closed it quickly. Missing us already, spoke one of the outlaws. Decker ignored him as he began to open drawers in the sheriff's desk. Robbing the law, boy? That'll get your neck stretched. Decker's heart pumped wildly now as he pulled with more fervency on the desk drawers, and at last one slid open with a thud. He saw what he was looking for. His thoughts caught up to him as his fingers wrapped themselves around the hilt of the pistol. His path forward became abundantly clear. He fumbled with it, but finally opened the cylinder, revealing 3 bullets within. What have you got planned, son? Spoke the outlaw, as Decker closed the action and darted for the door best he could. He hobbled back out into the street and down to the pharmacy. Chapter 10. The door creaked open as the pharmacist recognized him immediately. Ah, lad. Odd bit of business this morning, wasn't it? His kind face turned into a smile. Lucky for you, Charlie is the law in these parts. Go over the moon to prove a man innocent, just as well as guilty he would. I need another tincture. Use the one I gave you yesterday, already. The pharmacist's face bloomed in curiosity. It was broken. Ah, I see. No worry, lad, I'll get you another one. He opened a few cabinets and poured a large jar of liquid into a smaller vial and sealed it with a dropper top. Decker's hand grew sweaty around the grip of the pistol, and as the pharmacist finished, he turned back to Decker. "All right, lad, that'll be $5. Decker's body again was acting on its own as he pulled the pistol from his pocket, pointing it at the pharmacist. Give me the medicine." Decker's voice wavered as his heart thumped, his face running flush with heat. "Lad, what are you—" "The medicine!" The shout was harsh, leaving his throat. Okay, said the pharmacist, placing the medicine on the counter. Decker grabbed it quickly and hobbled to the door, the pain in his leg increasing with every step. He was back on the street, in the snow. He spun around looking for a horse, any horse. He spied one tied to a barn. He hobbled over to it. Looking down, he saw he was leaving red specks of blood behind him. Just a little longer, he thought. I need to live just a little longer. Decker untied the horse and moved to climb into the saddle. "What in the hell you think you're doing?" came a voice from inside the building as a man burst through the door. "Stop," Decker said weakly as he pulled the pistol from his pocket. The man kept moving forward. "Don't! Stop!" He thumbed the hammer back as the man gripped his coat, and Decker pulled the trigger. The blast from the pistol cut through the air, ending all peace in the town. The man fell to the ground, slumping face first into the snow, unmoving. Decker's eyes went wide with disbelief. The horse startled, pulling the reins out of his hands and taking off down the streetway. "No!" Decker yelled into the air as he took a step forward. Pain shot up his leg in a surge of 1,000 pins. He collapsed into the snow, his breath shallow and labored. His hands shook as he felt all his strength leave his body. He stood again with a wobble. He spied another horse tied to the back of a building as the street began to fill with townsfolk curious about the commotion. Each step he took now was excruciating, sending agony up his whole body. He untied the horse as several people began to follow him. He clambered into the saddle. He dug his heels into the horse and sprinted the creature forward as several people began to shout after him. The town rushed past him, and soon he was down the road leading into the woods. The trees were dark as they whipped past, the air biting into his face and piercing through his coat, chilling his core as he pushed the horse faster and faster. His head grew dizzy as he began to lose track of how long he had been riding. He leaned forward, almost falling out of the saddle as his head began to spin. He pulled back on the reins, bringing the horse to a stop. He craned his neck, looking around. The horse began to trot in circles as he tried desperately to see anything familiar. "Abigail!" The scream left his throat in a panic. "Abigail!" It was louder now. Had I passed her? The thought brimmed, spiking within him. He pushed the horse back on the path he had just come, all the while whipping his head in search of her. "Abigail!" He brought the horse to a stop again, spinning in circles, searching the thicket for any sign of the shelter he built for her. "Abigail!" The scream left him lightheaded. Panic gripped him as his limbs grew cold and weariness crept upon him. He pushed the horse back down the trail, going further down the road than he previously had before. "Abigail!" He spun in circles as a growing desperation began to consume him. He circled the horse for a long time before he spied it, a shallow mound of snow with what looked like branches underneath it. He sprinted the horse over to the mound and attempted to dismount the horse, only for his foot to get tangled in the stirrup, causing him to fall face first into the snow. He lifted himself up, trying to stand, only to fall back down again. He crawled towards the mound. As he brushed back the snow, he saw some of the branches were missing, torn. He lifted the branches off in a fury. "Abigail!" His voice trailed. The small shelter was empty as Decker stared through the small opening, his brow furrowed, trying to make sense of what he saw. At the bottom of the shelter, frozen in the mud, a paw print. "A wolf?" he whispered to himself, his brain desperately trying to connect what he was seeing to where Abigail was. He pulled more branches from the shelter, revealing more paw prints and a small piece of torn fabric. He grabbed at the fabric, clutching it in his hand. Abigail. "Hold it right there, boy," shouted a voice from behind him. Decker spun to see several men on mounted horses, all with rifles pointed at him. "Move, and you'll be shot." Chapter 11. Decker closed his eyes, though sleep never came. It hadn't come to him at all since they had put him in the cell. It had been a few days since he had lost Abigail. He clenched his fist as his memory swam to Clayton. His eyes shot open, wishing to set the roof above him on fire. to collapse the jail upon him, burning himself along with all the wretched memories of his older brother, with all his anger. The hate boiled within him till he shook, the tremor sending waves of agony into his leg. It was horribly swollen and hot to the touch, leaking a pus from the bullet's entry wound. But he was to be hanged, so they had little incentive to repair a dead man, much less a murderer and a horse thief. Decker lay flat on his back as tears came to him now, wishing he could just be back in the farmhouse, wishing he could just have stayed in the farmhouse instead of following Clayton. Clayton. He thought his brother's name with a vile malice he yearned beyond all else to bring to fruition. His stomach churned, feeling hot within him as he clenched his fist tighter, digging his fingernails into his palms. Clayton. He whispered the name aloud, letting it leave his mouth with a curse upon it. The door to the jailhouse opened with a gust of wind chasing the man who entered. Decker lay on the wooden floor. The wind burst over him, causing his skin to chill, but he remained still. "Today's the day, lad," spoke one of the deputies. Decker looked into his eyes as he spoke, and his face remained vacant. "You ain't never told anybody why you done what you done. Thought you might like to tell it now." "Anger," said Decker, low and uncaring. "Anger?" repeated the deputy. "And that's all you'll say?" Decker looked away and back to the jail roof. "Hell, boy, everyone gets angry from time to time. No reason to kill a man. To make a widow of his wife. I would do it again to save her." "Save who, boy? When?" asked Decker. "When what? When will I be hanged?" "In a hurry, are ya? The sheriff should be here momentarily to escort you to the noose." The deputy shook his head. "You're young. Younger than someone ought to be to die this way, to have this much anger in him. What would your ma think of all this?" "Don't talk about her." Decker's voice was a threat. "I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry, but you don't end up where you are now because life went so well for you. But I do think you ought to leave behind your story, the why of it all." "What good would that do?" "Ease my conscience, for starters. For having a hand in hanging a boy. Might ease your anger. You stole that horse for a reason. You robbed the pharmacist for a reason. Murdered for a reason. You say you'll do it again to save her. Save who?" "She's dead now. It don't matter how you feel. Or me." Decker's voice was hollow. No, I suppose it don't," said the deputy as the door opened and the sheriff walked in. "Get him to his feet," said the sheriff. The deputy unlocked the cell door and lifted Deckers to his feet. Decker stumbled back to the floor, his leg utterly useless to him now. "Doing you a favor, we are hanging you. With that leg, you'll only last another night or two, and it would be rough," said the sheriff. The sheriff walked into the cell and lifted Decker's arm over his shoulder as the deputy took the other side. They helped him out of the jailhouse and into the snow. A crowd had gathered at the edge of town. The townsfolk yelled all manner of hatred at him. Decker felt none of it. He saw the noose standing above the crowd, looming amongst the snow flurries and cold gray sky. They walked him up and onto the platform and pulled the noose around his neck. The rope was wet and cold. The frost collected on it and melted against his skin, dripping down his chest. He shivered. Decker balanced on one leg, looking out into the crowd of townsfolk, as his eyes darted between them, pulling in their faces, hoping to find one displaying kindness or sorrow. His eyes found something else, a familiar face. And as he studied the face, disbelief swallowed him. But as he kept staring, it was unmistakable. Clayton. His stomach twisted in rage. His chest convulsed, permeating anger throughout his limbs. He screamed, uttering such a guttural, fervid roar the whole crowd stepped back, recoiling from his fury, their faces of hate turning to fear. Decker stepped forward, putting weight on his dead leg, causing him to collapse, falling into the noose. His eyes welded themselves to Clayton's, never breaking the gaze as the good leg struggled to regain his balance. "Damn it, boy," yelled the sheriff, grabbing Decker by the arm to pull him back to a standing position. Decker flailed wildly, kicking at the sheriff as his foot contacted the sheriff's hip, pushing him away, causing him to lose balance and slip on the wooden platform. "Pull the lever!" shouted the sheriff. The deputy yanked on the lever to the trapdoor, Decker's foot caught the edge of the hole as he flailed, holding his body near horizontal to the ground. Angled slightly upward, his face still towards the crowd, his eyes still open and set upon Clayton. Decker breathed in again and let loose another roar, deep and painful, filled to the brim with a loathing unbearable for the townsfolk as some turned running from him. Clayton stood still, never breaking the hate-filled gaze Decker set upon him. Decker's face turned a deep red as the roar left him, spit being flung from his lips. The sheriff gained his footing and drew his pistol. Decker felt the cold metal barrel through his hair, chilling his scalp. He never heard the shot.